So welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good lunch. There's still food left over but don't sneak out during our wonderful keynote address, please. It is now my very great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Freeman Hrabowski. Freeman is president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, a position he's held since 1992, and he looks the same as the first day I met him. His list of honors is remarkable, and reading them could take up the rest of the afternoon, so I'll not do that. I'll just cite a few since 1992. In 2008, he was named one of America's best leaders by U.S. News and World Report, which ranked UMBC the nation's #1 up-and-coming universities in 6 years. In 2015 and 16, U.S. News ranked UMBC in the top 5 on a newly created list of the nation's most innovative national universities. Time magazine named him one of America's 10 best college presidents in 2009 and one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2012. I had the pleasure of visiting Freeman shortly after I came to NSF and fairly shortly after Freeman joined the university. I was taken aback, I have to say, by the progress that he'd already made in a very short time. But it turns out that was just the beginning of an extraordinary record of academic leadership and achievement for his university and all the thousands of young men and women he helped launch successful careers. He is the perfect leader to share some wisdom about innovation, leadership, and partnerships. So Freeman, thank you for all you have done and continue to do, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Please welcome Freeman Hrabowski.
Thank you very much, Neil. I remember when you came to campus in my first year, and it was great as head of NSF to come and recognize not just what we were doing, but what we were trying to do as we were looking at some of the challenges we face in our country. When I think about the National Academies, I think about two names. First, Bill Wolfe and Chuck Vest. And as something that each said, one in the late 90s, about 97, Bill was talking to a big group, and he asked them why did people think that most human beings, and just starting with our own country, are living much longer, going from a lifespan of maybe 40 years in 1900 now to almost double that. And nobody suggested clean water or the sewer system. They got to medicine, perhaps, but not the others. And his point was about the importance of engineering at the time, that people don't give engineers any credit for still being in the world, for living. And interestingly enough, years later, Chuck's comment built on that, and he said that, quite frankly, most of the increase we've had in our lifespans can be attributed to science, engineering, and medicine. Now, here's what I want you to think about as a theme as I talk for the next 15, 20 minutes. Jim Collins made the comment that we should think about the genius of the and versus the tyranny of the or. We tend to think about one thing or the other. You're either for this or you're for that. And so people tend to think about we are for basic research or we're for applied research, as opposed to the genius of understanding we need both, of course. Or people, when talking about STEM, will sometimes be criticized and saying, well, that means you're against or you don't appreciate the arts, humanities, and social sciences. And so I want us to think, as we think about the future of collaboration, I want us to think about clearly the sciences and engineering, math, and everything, but also about those other areas, some of which are considered a part of the sciences, but the humanities and arts, the genius of this and as we're preparing people, as we work to solve problems, the grand challenges, obviously will focus heavily on that notion of interdisciplinarity. But I also want us to think about the notion of one type of institution or another, and public versus private, research versus other kinds of institutions, and, quite frankly, the public sector versus the private sector. And I would argue that if we can keep the thought of the genius of the and, of talking about what we're doing in working with companies, with state agencies, with the federal government, with foundations, with every sector of our society, and understanding what it takes to work collaboratively. And I would argue that the same challenge we face in the country of not having been taught how to listen to different perspectives, is the challenge we face right now as we think about finding the common ground, the points of intersection. I saw my former tennis partner who always beat me, who's here with crutches or something, my fellow mathematician, we share that. And he and I would both say we spend our lives trying to get people to love math. Now, I'll ask the question here. How many of you love math? This is music to our ears, right? Well, here I'm going to give you 2 or 3 stories very quickly, and you'll appreciate it as I talk about what I would see is what we as a country must do to build the enthusiasm for the research enterprise and for producing the workforce for that enterprise. It is this, that I was speaking to a group of very privileged Americans who are associated with some of the most prestigious independent schools in their region. And these were highly educated people, all with multiple degrees, all having gone to the most socially prestigious high schools and universities in the country. And I simply asked the question, how many of you enjoy math? How many of you like math? Or how many of you had a good experience with math? Any of those, just giving different questions. And I think perhaps 20%. 20%. And I thought to myself, if the most privileged of them, these were 95% white, very wealthy people from great advantage. And yet, what I was listening to, what I watched, people just saying, no. Now, if I ask the question, how many of you love to read, it's obvious. Everybody will raise their hands, and it is such a difference. Now, I tell you that because as I think about what we need to be doing to build these partnerships, I would start with the notion that we will need to focus on the culture of our society. And that has everything to do with what we value, with the things we talk about, with what we invest in, obviously, with also what we're willing to fight for, what the incentives are, and perhaps most importantly, the willingness to look in the mirror itself for the society. And equally important, if we in the research enterprise are to have a dramatic shift in the level of support given to science and engineering, math, and to our universities, we're going to need to rethink the internal, the culture, to look in the mirror ourselves and say, why is it? What is it we're not doing that we should be doing to make a difference? My fellow college presidents either smile when I say this, or they get a little angry with me, and sometimes I'd rather people become a little angry than be bored. I want them to think about what I'm saying, if you get my point. In fact, we often say true leadership means keeping everybody minimally dissatisfied. I want you to think about that, minimally dissatisfied, all right? All right, if everybody's happy, you're not doing much, okay? And this is what I've said this to groups of college presidents, that we all complain about Congress. We know we can't get a lot done. If we haven't studied history, we don't realize there have been many times in the past, in the 60s, 1800s, 1900s, when there was that split and not getting much done. Also, before, for example, Johnson in the late 60s. But I tell you that for this reason. The fact is that those members of Congress and our elected officials in our states, they're all our graduates. They're our graduates. And the question is, what difference did we make in their lives? I'm often thinking about that as people come across my campus. Did we make a difference beyond some skills development? In their attitude, in their willingness to hear different perspectives, in their understanding, if they're in literature, that science is important, and there are ways in which they'll use technology and ways in which they should appreciate science. And similarly, for my scientists, are they able to understand ethical considerations? And so it's this question of what we as universities should be doing. When we have these conferences, and I had someone telling me regularly, my colleague Peter Henderson, who was here and who works with me now at the university, some of the things that people were saying, and these are the things that are really important to say, whether it is about what we do as research universities, or it is about how much we need to be communicating. I would add to what's been said already, I would argue that one of the grand challenges that we need to take on is how to prepare people at different levels, not simply to understand science, engineering in these areas, but how to talk about it in a way that is not off-putting and that pulls people in. And that has everything to do with who is becoming a scientist and how we envision the future for our country in science. I had the privilege of chairing the Obama Commission on Educational Excellence for African Americans, and I had the chance then to get all the data to look at what's happening at the national agencies. I can tell you there's not one national agency in our country that can tell me that even 1% of the scientists are African American. Not one. And you get to Hispanics, and you're talking still 2 or 3%. And so one of the ineluctable questions is this. If people don't see themselves represented in an endeavor, why should they first trust the endeavor? And secondly, what do they perceive will be possible for their own children? Because if people don't see themselves or their kids becoming a part of something, it's distant from them, even when you tell them that their lives are longer because of something that happened there. We forget that it's only been since the 40s that we were able to really build the major research universities in our country. If we think about 200 research universities, perhaps 60 are really that biggest enterprise among that group, and they represent about 60% of the productivity. Well, then you've got the other 140, my campus included, who represent about 40%. And the question is, again, the genius of the and versus the tyranny of the or. How do we bring those two groups together to look at both innovation, ways of having the connections to industry, how we go about working with public officials? Some would say politics are local. How do we help our local folks understand the importance of science and engineering? I've got several colleagues here from the University System of Maryland. I mentioned Britt, and the head of economic development here, and others are here from my state. And what I would say to you that reinforces what others have said is this, that we have, I think, a more privileged situation than most, in that we have a set of research campuses and other types of institutions in our system and in the state, and public and privates working together, and quite frankly, with a number of initiatives that build on the research enterprise. So the Maryland Innovation Initiative focused on opportunities for faculty from the research campuses to play into a pool of money, rather, that's from the state, designed to help in tech transfer and commercialization. And we've had a number of those grants. I would say as a mid-sized university, what you will appreciate is the fact that we appreciate the need to connect with other institutions. So we have major grants, hundreds of millions of dollars over the years that we've gotten in working with the major research campuses from College Park, UMB, and Hopkins. And what's significant about that is in conjunction with the different national agencies from NASA, Goddard, and working with the Department of Energy, with NSF, NIH. And so we realize that we can get much more done and build synergy if we have these partnerships. A recent grant with NASA for $80 million split between us and College Park in space science, for example, and joint centers in Earth systems technology. But here's my point. When you think about smaller institutions and those that may not be in that top 60, the question is, how do we build the ecosystem in states and around the country where we have these strong partnerships across industry and our institutions and other institutions? Given that half of Americans start in community colleges, I think it is very short-sighted of us. It would be short-sighted of us, and I think of research universities, not to have connections to different kinds of institutions where almost half of the Americans are. And so having grants from Gates as well as NIH, having the state legislature interested in what's happening in community colleges, having opportunities for those first-generation college students to get into science and engineering, to be thinking about becoming scientists, to come to all kinds of universities, I think is a part of that building of the continuum and of an ecosystem where one side is strengthening the other. And it has everything to do with asking the right questions, building trust among the institutions, but having a broader vision. I would challenge us, as we talk about the society and its lack of emphasis on science, its lack of appreciation, I would say we have not brought the level of rigor of thinking to the challenge. The same thing is true with the broad area of broadening participation. It is right now, in my estimation, after 40 years in this business, it is a box to be checked. People mean well, we haven't figured out how to do it. So 85% of faculty broadly are white in America. When President Kennedy spoke to the National Academies at the 100th anniversary, it was the same year that I went to jail with Dr. King as a child, and spent a week there thinking about, well, what's the future for the kids here in Birmingham, but what's the future for our country? And I was a kid who was a math nerd. And my newest book is on just that, how being in that civil rights movement led to my thinking about producing scientists. And when I began talking, and Neil knows this, when I was talking about being a place that became a beacon for kids who would go on and get PhDs in science, many places, including foundations, would say, well, it will take several more generations. Well, we just got the data yesterday. We're still the only predominantly white campus in the top 10 in producing African Americans who get PhDs in science, and just found out yesterday that we have produced more African American MD PhDs in the history of our country than any other university. Give my faculty a round of applause for that, would you? And to put that in perspective, we got the list, and the list, Harvard has 17 since 2000, and Morehouse and Xavier have about 12, and it goes down from there. So Harvard is number 2. We're number 1. We have 44. Another big round of applause. It's a huge deal. It really is. But this is what I want you to think about. This is what I want you to think about as you think about the future of research universities as we connect 2 or 3 things. If we can think about a grand challenge for teaching people, whether they are math and science teachers, you've talked about that a little today, or they are in our faculties, our professors, people who can be communicators, effective communicators in helping people understand why it's important. I'll give you just one example. I know that what we do as a research campus for undergraduates of all races can make a difference in what happens in our state. The speaker pro tem is a psychology major from my campus, an African-American woman, and who had some substantive experiences with research while at UMBC. Well, she has helped us get so much money. I don't mean my campus, the entire state. Our legislators, and I do give Rick Curran credit for having been the kind of leader coming out of STEM who can just talk in a regular way to people so they're not put off by the experience. But the fact is that we've had billions of dollars of construction. For my young campus, I just looked at the numbers. When we looked since about 2000, with the 2 new science buildings we're getting, one down at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, and then an interdisciplinary life sciences building on our campus, the main campus, and then one at Shady Grove that's called translational science. Those 2 buildings alone are $250 million. We've had literally $1 billion in construction since 2000, most in STEM. Why? Because of legislators whom we've worked with for years to understand that the future of Maryland is directly tied to the strength of a science and technology infrastructure, to educating people in general and focusing on getting more kids through K through 12, of course, pre-K through 12, but to the strength of the higher education system, and in particular, looking at what we're doing in technology and science. And so I can tell you as an example of that ecosystem, and because of policies in our state that legislators understood as being important to their jurisdictions, we now have over 100 biotech and IT companies on our campus that, quite frankly, we are really strong in cybersecurity, that we are working with MITRE. We are part of their FFRDC, that major 25-year, $5 billion deal. That's with the system. This is, again, the importance sometimes of, so that's College Park and UMBC together, working with MITRE, with a number of other campuses around the country. But the idea is that that's a cybersecurity FFRDC at NIST. And why is that important? It's that idea of the companies working, looking at the financial industry, looking at the defense industry, the same thing with Northrop Grumman. I mean, the idea for us is to have as many people marrying us. And our colleagues have gotten beyond the idea that working with companies is tainting the institution. Nobody's going to do at a university what they don't want to do. I always tell new presidents, don't you ever think you can tell people what to do. You cannot. Believe me, you cannot. You can persuade, but reason prevails. And so having the opportunities, as has been the case since the 40s in our country, quite frankly, as you think about the building of research universities after World War II and that World War II time, the idea is that the most prestigious institutions have been connected and have understood the importance of understanding the needs of our society, both in terms of not just intelligence and military, but in terms of healthcare and so many areas, all the way over to the other side of research that does involving the arts and the humanities, social sciences, and the big issues of inequality, academic achievement gap, health disparities, one of our big areas in public policy. And so how do we get the public to appreciate that the way we move ahead as a center of innovation for our whole country will be through these institutions? I want to close with this, because I want to have time for questions. It's the final story. In the late 40s, in the mid 40s, President Roosevelt had recommended legislation for the GI Bill. We've all heard of the GI Bill. But there was one group that fought that bill more than any other. And it was people in my category, college presidents, from the most prestigious of universities. And they said, if those veterans are led into our institutions, those institutions will become academic hobo jungles. Now, that was not about race. That's about regular white guys, some women and some blacks. Now, were they bad people? Of course not. We're all products of our experiences. They were liberally educated, highly privileged, and fine people. I get that. I'm a Southerner. You can be a fine person and still have blinders. But you get my point? That's just real. Now, here's my point that I want you to think about. It is this. Within several years, those veterans had shown the country that regular people could come in, do a superb job in that work, and go on and help with the enterprise of the country in many ways, and the evolution of the middle class. So that in 1965, when the Higher Education Act was passed, still only 10% of Americans had a college degree. Most Americans did not think their kids would ever go to college of any race. So if they didn't think they would go to college, obviously it's only been 50 years that Americans have considered the possibility that their kids might become researchers or scientists. So it is a part of an experiment that we're in. The challenge we face right now is to pull many more people into that experiment. A young man from Mechanicsville, Maryland, as I close, came to my campus, intellectually curious, really with wonderful, old-fashioned, little-town values. I always tell my kids who are from small towns who feel a little uncomfortable, don't worry about not being from New York City. You're going to be just fine. You've got that stability. And this kid came in biochemistry, studied in Africa, and amazingly did wonderful research, did some publishing. And my disappointment was he decided not to go on for the PhD part. He did go for the MD part, went to Indiana U, did really well, went to Berkeley, got a degree in public health, but was involved in research the whole time, came back, became faculty tenured at Indiana, and administrator. But he also then became health commissioner of Indiana and had a big fight with the vice president because he was determined to have the exchange of needles. He understood the importance of research. He understood that he needed to prove to that state that if you exchange the needles, you will reduce the spread of AIDS, and you will have chances for many more people to get drug help with the drug addiction. And the vice president, who had been the governor at that time, who had been very much against him, against that practice, rather, watched, and the research and the data showed that this young man was correct. And it became that policy. That young man went on and was nominated and got wonderful, wonderful, wonderful approval from Congress. He's now the Surgeon General. And here's the point. If you read what he says, his agency will be making decisions based on science and data. Now, it took a research campus working with a little undergrad kid from a country town so that he would know data can make the difference. There's our challenge as you think about the genius of the and the tyranny of the or. Thank you all very much. Let's take questions. Take 2 questions. Can I get a couple questions from somebody, please? And I should tell you as you come up that if you get a chance, look at the replication effort. About 2 big research campuses, Chapel Hill and Penn State, are replicating with Howard Hughes, major funding, the Meyerhoff program. And what's great about that is it's all about culture change. And the most important thing I can say to researchers here is it takes researchers to produce researchers. Did you get that? It's not minority staff on the side. It takes researchers to produce. Look at the record of Michael Summers. He's produced more African Americans who've gone on to get PhD in biochemistry anybody in the country. Big deal.
Congratulations and kudos to you for all the good work you've done.
Thank you.
And I have a quick question. I think one of the big motivations for students to pursue STEM field is jobs.
Yes.
Career placement.
Yes.
However, we are now at many universities face an issue that many companies require minimum GPA of 3.0, even for internships.
Yes.
And we found out that a lot, because of competition of various kinds, there's a significant number of students that come in with fewer AP credits and therefore they are less competitive in the classrooms.
Yes.
So they cannot get good grades.
Yes.
And so
Excellent question.
They don't get 3.0 GPA.
Right.
And this group of students are overrepresented by students from underrepresented ethnic groups.
Yes.
So how do you think we can address that?
Let me start by saying that when I first moved to UMBC 30 years ago, I could not find one African American who had earned an A in any upper-level science or engineering course. And when my colleagues said that's not true, everyone they found had been educated in another country. They were either French-speaking or British, but not from D.C., Baltimore, anywhere could I find one, okay? Now, why do I tell you that? And that's when we started that Meyerhoff program, and that focused on building community among the students and looking at what it would take to get kids to get to the level of at least a B. And that made progress, but what really made the difference was when faculty said, some of the things you're doing for Meyerhoff, we should be doing for white kids and others in general. Now Meyerhoff has students of all races, though it's heavily minority, and we've had support from a number of the agencies here. But here's what I want you to hear. It was my colleagues who said, not only on my campus, but again, led by USM and Brit, course redesign was a big deal. It was the idea that how do we rethink the teaching and learning process. Most institutions, and I go around the country, have not changed what they do, how they do it in years. We still call the first year of STEM weed out courses. And I get people asking me all the time, how do we get the scientific community in America to stop saying or thinking that when most people don't make it, it's just a matter that they're not completely qualified and the work is just that hard and it wasn't meant for everybody. And I think that's a very simplistic approach. I think that, yes, it's going to be very hard for more students to succeed. It's been the way on my campus, especially for blacks and Hispanics, when I've got 30% coming from Asian countries, and I've got students from Russia, China, India, whatever, who are so well prepared and so intense. And my kids from the Caribbean who are hungry, right? So your kid from DC or New York is not going to have that as a rule. First-generation Americans bring that hunger. So what we've been able to do is to take that hunger and couple it with building community among students, but to have faculty who've said, let's redesign courses, let's rethink how we do the teaching. I don't see that. When I said changing the culture in STEM, we do still just assume most won't make it. And my proof is, look at the number of seats in the second year of work compared to the first year of work. It's going to be substantially lower. When we chaired the National Academy's Committee on Underrepresentation, we said, well, it was a problem for blacks and Hispanics, but only 32% of whites who began with a major in natural sciences and engineering actually make it. And the higher the AP credits, and the higher the SAT, and the more socially prestigious the university, the greater the probability that many of those students, whites, are not succeeding. I always say, kids start off thinking engineering or science, they become great lawyers. It happens all the time. It happens all the time. I say it jokingly, but it's true. Why? Because the work is not as predictable. If you can read and write and think well and you work hard, you can get a B. But in physics and mathematics, there's a level of unpredictability. Building community, but also I'm suggesting that it's not just about those students getting more work. They need to have the support, yes. There can be other approaches to helping them to succeed. But I will tell you, most institutions in our country have not rethought how they teach, all right, and how you use technology and how you build community. Most places are still cutthroat, and we don't build communities among people. I see it all over the country. And because the more prestigious we are, the more we think we're just fine. And that's exactly what the research university said in the late 40s about why they didn't see the need to bring veterans in. It is the same challenge. I want to be provocative here. I'm saying institutions need to look in the mirror. They can do a better job themselves, even as they work to focus on these issues. One compliment, Purdue has been known for women in engineering for years. They made it a priority. I'm very proud that the first black PhD in computer science from Purdue is one of my undergrads. The first black woman PhD from Michigan in computer science, one of mine. Full professor in chemical engineering at Michigan, one of my graduates there. Now, why do I tell you that? Purdue also produced the woman who was one of my co-PIs on our advanced grant, and she just was stolen from us from being dean, my first woman dean of engineering, to become the dean at Virginia Tech. But she got her undergrad experience at Purdue, then she went to Rice. But my point is, she was in an institution that had made women in engineering a priority, the way we're working to make all these areas priorities. And so what I'm saying is, it can be done. I think you should look at what places like Chapel Hill and Penn State are doing as they work with us even on replicating. And come look at what the University System of Maryland is doing. A number of the institutions have rethought in mathematics, the TPSE program. I mean, these chairs of math are making a difference. You know, and I've seen my campus and others I'm affiliated with of changing attitudes of department chairs to say, let's get involved as a research university at what's happening at community colleges and in the freshman year work. The fact is, most research universities consider that undergrad experience, especially the first 2 years, to something that you do to get people through to a certain level with grad students. And then they want to know why the public doesn't care. I mean, the more brilliant we are, the more clueless we seem sometimes to be. Let me be provocative here. We are clueless in understanding if you mistreat people, if I tell you 2/3 of Americans get wiped out of science, why should they ever care about what happens to the scientific enterprise? You get my point? That's the challenge. Last question. Last question. Yes.
So, thank you.
Yes. Hi.
Very, as always, inspiring.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. Yes, we know that we need to change the culture, but
Yes.
in practice, that's not very easy.
Yes.
And you've had all these great experiences. Do you have any recommendation for us
Yes.
that we can do it a little bit more expeditiously
Yes.
and effectively?
Yes.
And by the way, are you running for U.S. president?
You're biased, so shut up. Let me say this, and when you hear me sounding so passionate, I am so respectful of all the institutions here. What I'm saying to you, I'm saying to my own campus. We are still challenged and working on diversifying the faculty. It's a big deal that we finally got the first black in some departments, but the nice news, the first piece of information is that the progress we're making now as we move to get our second black and Hispanic, and we work to get more women, is that we have had the most powerful faculty deciding to come together in a group called STRIDE to help change the attitudes of other people. And the most powerful faculty on any of our campuses will first be white men. I don't say that as a disparaging comment, it is simply the truth. So if you look at my book, you'll see a white guy with a black kid and a Korean kid on there, because I'm trying to make the point, we've got to go across these areas and to say that all of us can make a difference. Expeditiously, I would say what we need, institutions need to be doing with this work what they do in the labs. That is experimenting with some rigor. You'll find a number of articles we've written on the theory of change and on ways of doing this work, but the key is it's trying something different, looking at best practices, including starting with small groups to see if you can make a difference. Finally, let me just say to you, this is not just for science. I was working with a symphony today on the problem that you can't find. If you look at any of the symphonies in our country, you are hard-pressed to find African Americans and Hispanics. And wonderfully, Baltimore Symphony is working on that, and they want to look at how you use the model of getting somebody to sit in the symphony orchestra as a qualified musician is like getting somebody through the PhD program, through a postdoc, and then making sure they get into the faculty, and then making sure they get tenure. Did you get the layers? Right? Because right now, the biggest challenge I face is that even as we're producing PhDs, MD PhDs, they'll pull them to the clinical side, just in terms of MD PhDs. And secondly, that most of the minority PhDs I'm finding, even when they finish the best of programs in the country, will be pulled into something that's not bench science. And my last point to you is it's not enough to be a mentor. We must have champions who will knock down doors and who will be so constructively critical of the people to make them better, but also to challenge institutions to find people different from themselves. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Freeman, for being with us today, for giving such stirring remarks, and for all that you have been doing and continue to do.